Pints with Jack, Season 3, Episode 33. After Hours with Dr. Brenton Dickieson. Good morning. Welcome to Pints with Jack, a podcast where two enthusiastic C.S. Lewis amateurs get together, share a beverage, and discuss a work of C.S. Lewis. And this season we've been reading Till We Have Faces, but today is one of our After Hours episodes. And so today I'm joined by Dr. Brenton Dickieson from his blog, A Pilgrim in Narnia. I wanted to bring him on the show for quite some time now, so when he started a new blog series on Till We Have Faces, I thought that was the perfect excuse. So here's a little bit of his background. Besides teaching in the literature department at Signum University, Dr. Dickieson is adjunct instructor in literature at King's College in New York City, sessional professor in the Center for Study of Christianity and Culture at the University of Prince Edward Island, and instructor in spiritual theology at Regent College in Vancouver, BC. He also does freelance speaking and writing and is the author of the popular faith, fiction, and fantasy blog, A Pilgrim in Narnia. After completing his master's degree in biblical literature at Regent College, Brenton moved with his wife Kerry and his son Nicholas to their native home in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, to teach and write. His academic interests include how the creation of fictional universes help in spiritual formation, theological exploration, and cultural criticism. And he's just completed his PhD at the University of Chester, focusing his work on C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the Inklings. Dr. Dickieson, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm a listener, and so great to sit here in the chair now.
Well, I'm sitting in my chair drinking a nice cup of Tetley's tea. Are you having anything?
Yeah, well, it's of course a famous thing to talk about, and I'm afraid I don't have a nice scotch or something. It's also the middle of the day. But the one thing to note is that C.S. Lewis was a cider drinker, and I'm not a huge cider fan, but we've got this great local company called Red Island Cider here in Prince Edward Island, and they've got this Father Walker's dry cider. Now, Father Walker was sort of a famous figure from the late 19th century, and then in 1898 they decided to have a church picnic to raise money for some cause, and he was able to get several barrels of apple cider donated to the picnic, and it turns out that they had given them the hard cider instead of the soft cider, and so this became like a fairly famous picnic. It became quite rowdy. They raised tons of money and it's become kind of one of our most infamous events of our little local history. And so I think it's nice to have this kind of little touch of the local here. I'm also nursing a Newfoundland coffee called Jumping Beans, but this is my cheers drink, I guess. Yeah,
I love it. And you pastors, pay attention to that story. Next time you're doing a fundraiser, the better the alcohol, the more people will donate.
It's like it's a happy accident, I guess, is how the theologians might have put it. Right?
Accident, sure. So that was the drink of the week and the quote of the week. Since your blog is A Pilgrim in Narnia, I thought I'd go for something from the Pilgrim's Regress. One road leads home, and 1,000 roads lead into the wilderness.
It's awesome. That's a good one. I hadn't coded that in my mind, so that's great.
Well, if you follow us on Instagram, I just released a graphic for it. And before we cheers, each week we toast one of our Patreon supporters, and today I'd like to toast Anthony Petz. Anthony, may your heart always be as full as my cup of tea. Cheers. So, Dr. Dickieson, could you just fill in a little bit of your personal history for the listeners? When were you first introduced to C.S. Lewis?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I was a young adult convert to Christianity, and C.S. Lewis's name was always around. I had read a bit of Narnia as a kid, especially loved Magician's Nephew, but and I had heard about the sci-fi and always intended to get there. I just never did. I'm a sci-fi lover, and I was really taken up by the 80s stuff, that kind of austere, dry land, empty spaces kind of sci-fi. And
Dune, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Dune. It was all the copies of Dune, and so like Gene Wolfe and Roger Zelazny and all them that are making these complex, lots of walking kind of sci-fi books, and so that was kind of what I was into. And then slowly, though, I almost felt like I had to read C.S. Lewis. Like it was kind of like a requirement, like one of the ladders to eternity or something. And
the ladder of divine ascent.
That's right. And so I had a copy of Mere Christianity that I went in and bought at a bookstore, and I can actually see like the different times I tried to read it, and never really fully got into it. One of them was on a beach in Thailand, and there's still probably some Thai beach sand kind of stuck in there. And I always did really well in the first few chapters, which are about the kind of the philosophical reason we have for believing there's a God. But I really struggle with the book as a whole. And I always got a few chapters in and then set it down, a few chapters in and set it down. But I was working in Japan. My wife and I were there, and we were working and volunteering with a little local church. And I showed up for a book study. It was an advanced English book study. And basically the teacher just handed me The Great Divorce, which I had not read, and sat me down with Japanese students and said, okay, now teach them this book, which I had not read. Like it was my first time holding a copy, was sitting there in the chair, in the center there, and I still stole the copy from the church. I still have that here on my shelf. Hadn't read the preface, didn't know what the context was or what it was. I didn't know what it was about. And basically, it's about purgatory, which is pretty weird. And and then I sat down, and I actually had to look words up in the first paragraph. They were just words that I hadn't really encountered before. One was the word Q, which then I had to try and teach Japanese to say a word that I didn't yet know the answer to. Anyway, it was just a kind of a funny moment, but it really kind of caught my imagination. I read it, and then I read it again, and I let it soak in. And as I did my master's degree, I went through all of Lewis's fiction. But it was trying to come back to Mere Christianity was tough. And so finally I bought the audiobook, and I listened to the audiobook, and I felt kind of guilty, like I was cheating. You know?
No. If any listeners out there, if you think listening to audiobooks is cheating, let me just put that to rest. If that's the best way you consume media, you do it. I get through way more audiobooks than I do physical books, and I love reading.
Yeah, of course, you're running a podcast. I run a blog.
That's true.
But of course, they were lectures to begin with. Why should I feel kind of odd about listening to them? And I was really able to kind of draw Lewis in at that moment. And I understood finally that there was a wholeness to the book that I never saw before. And that the book isn't really, I mean, it is a work of apologetics, but it's a more powerful book of spiritual life. And that's really what the arrow of that book is shooting towards as you read through. And he uses that word spiritual life throughout. He also calls it Zoe, the Greek word. And then that just kind of drew me in. And I got sucked in by the literature, and then I would, the fiction, and then I would go off and read one or two of the other books. And it was ultimately, though, My final turn to C.S. Lewis was an academic failure. I had this great project that I proposed for a PhD about emerging things in American religion and North American religion. And those things like all of a sudden emerged, and culture began changing really quickly. And so my PhD was already out of date. I think it's actually Lewis quote at the end of The Four Loves, like everything that isn't eternal is eternally out of date. And my PhD was it's the wrong thing. You shouldn't study something that's emerging. You should study it before or after it emerges. And so I was kind of depressed, and then this wild-haired guy sat down at the coffee shop I was sitting in and asked me what was wrong, and told me I was doing everything wrong. That it turns out he had a PhD in theology, and that you should never study a movement. You should always study a person, and then you can root yourself in their whole world, and then you can talk to everything else in the world from that perspective or against that perspective. And that's how it worked. I went and I read through my shelf about people that I wanted to spend basically a decade or so in conversation with, because a PhD and then the books that come after is about a decade. And ultimately, there were others that were interesting. If my German was better, I might have done Moltmann. If Latin was good, I might have done Augustine. But it was it was C.S. Lewis that caught my imagination, and he was somebody that I could read for fun while I was still in the midst of studying him. So that's how I got caught. I understand everybody else is caught in this kind of immediate rapturous kind of way, but for me it was a long build. And I found him very useful for being able to think about life and to think about culture. And then each time I discover something about him, then his stories then kind of fill out in beautiful ways. And so I feel like Narnia is a great children's book, but it's an even better adult book, adult series. Like it just is so much more fun once you've, read Dante or hiked an impossible trail or had a child, or had a business fail, or had a friendship rupture. Like then those books really kind of come alive, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'd add to that, Lewis gets better the more of him you read. Because when you read another of his works, you then now see that coloring everything else that you've ever read by him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Till We Have Faces is a book read twice. Like, I think like if when I do master's teaching with it, I tend to say, I want you to budget 2 readings. Maybe one audiobook, one paper, or if you don't like audio, just twice on paper, early in the semester and later. Because for me, it was far better the second time, but I've found that again and again and again for people is that the second reading is better than the first.
Yeah, the Till We Have Faces whiplash has worn off a little bit and you have some idea of what you're going into.
Well, it's like, is there another book like it?
No.
Someone may have an answer, yes to that, an affirmative answer. I don't. Like, I haven't encountered a book quite like this, although there are some probably books in that style. I've never... it's unusual. And I feel that way reading some other books too. But in this case, lots of Narnian-like things came later, and lots of Lewis's weird sci-fi kind of comes later, or you find them in the old magazines, the Pulp Fiction. But I don't know anything else like Till We Have Faces.
I keep meaning to ask this question more regularly to my guests. What is your favorite C.S. Lewis work?
Favorite book?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's The Great Divorce, absolutely. Yeah.
That is the correct answer.
Oh, are you in that world too, or?
Absolutely.
Oh, good. Yeah.
It is easily my favorite. I think it's the nicest mix of accessible, beautiful writing, some very clear spiritual lessons, and just some mind-bending concepts that rock people's world.
Oh yeah, I think like if you were to say, like if someone said, I'm going to give a day to C.S. Lewis, like a day of reading, 16 hours, right? That they get pizza delivered or something, then I would say Great Divorce has to be, I think it's at the center of what he's doing. And I think the center of his thought is found there. And I think it works as a good hinge point for all his work. And so I read, any chance I get, I try and talk about The Great Divorce or teach it. I understand not everybody likes it exactly.
Sure.
But there's a kind of brilliance there in both kind of the brightness of the world that's created, but also the sharpness of the text and ideas that I think are worth studying. Absolutely. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about your blog? What was it that motivated you to start A Pilgrim in Narnia?
I don't know. It's funny. It was, again, at a beach. I generally have lived on islands, almost always, or near the ocean. And so I guess it's not always surprising that this happens at beaches. But I was reading, there was a local pastor retired and gave away all his books. And I grabbed a bunch and dropped a bunch off to a local college. And then in that, I kept all the C.S. Lewis books. And in there was Letters to an American Lady, which is like, so this ends up being, other than the fiction, probably my 4th nonfiction book or something I read of Lewis's. So not really the best introduction, but to me it was just so immediate and living and pastoral, and this constant nudging of person to kind of let go of the chains they built around their own life, to trying to let those be released by not focusing so much on what's trapped inside the chains. And I didn't really get it all at first, but it kind of provoked me, and then I kept going back to it. And it turns out it was actually a valuable American First edition that I had that I was reading at the beach, but
Wow.
I didn't know that at the time. It was in a box. But the it sort of brought me in. And as I looked for blogs about C.S. Lewis, I found kind of lots of fan stuff because the Narnian films had just come out maybe 5 years before that or something, or were coming out. And so lots of fan stuff. And there were some like blogs that were the company that owns the books or colleges or something that have C.S. Lewis courses. But there wasn't really what I thought could happen, which was a sandbox for taking Lewis's ideas and works and then finding the ways that they connect to culture, faith, and spiritual life, other people's writings, history, biography. And that's where it began. And it was also intentionally a sandbox for my own ideas. So when I wanted to test out, it's like sometimes to find out if a joke is funny, you have to say it out loud. And that's basically how I think scholarship works, is that the writing is there to help us, shape the things that we want, get the stuff that's kind of just a hint in our mind, and then to get it out in the world. And so as I was reading Till We Have Faces again, I'm teaching it. Actually, I have a video discussion with students on Monday. But I was also thinking about this podcast. This whole kind of new thread has come into my mind. And so I'll need to take time. I can talk about it later, but I need to take time to work that thread out, to say it out loud. And so I'll use the blog for that. And the blog post has everything from like a 75 word, here's a thought, and I'll get back to it later, or a quick book review, all the way to like, I've done 5,000 word essays on there that aren't publishable anywhere, because they're not built in the right way, or I don't have time to get them out in the world. So I just put them there. So it's been great. It's been great for me to develop those ideas. And so that's what the thing was. I didn't know that there was sort of really a market for people really trying. I didn't realize how much people want to go deeper in their reading and are looking for ways to make those connections.
Yeah, I've had the same sort of surprise when we started the podcast. It was for a whole bunch of different reasons, but I've been amazed at the number of people who read a lot and they want more. They've read a particular book and they know there's more goodness in there. It's not even almost that they need an expert. They just need somebody to start talking about it and get the juices flowing and get the ideas going. And the number of times we've had people write to us and say, I really like this idea that you brought out, but I think you go too far. Have you thought about this idea? I was like, well, my reading experience has just been improved dramatically.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I'm sure that the podcasting does. Actually, I hear you guys talk about it, right? Where, you'll actually try an idea out and then you pull back from the idea as you're saying it out loud, right? Yeah. And I think there's a kind of a kitchen table naturalness to podcasts for that, right? Mine isn't quite like that. If it is, I'll say that. Like, I'm putting out something, this is totally tentative. You guys feel free to tear it apart. But this is I'm at with this. And generally it sharpens. It's not usually totally wrong or something. It's turned out useful. Like when I had to teach for the first time a whole course on C.S. Lewis, I had 50% of my lecture material all ready, and I was able to have a TA basically make slides from my blog posts that I was stunned at how much easier that was, the work already done. But it's still kind of discovery, this Till We Have Faces blogging experience that I've been doing this winter and spring, which has been maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks I put up a post. It's actually changed the way that I'm reading the book and helping me concentrate, in this case, on the leaves rather than the tree, the whole tree, and kind of fun and intimate ways.
So what I'd like to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about Till We Have Faces in general and talk about some of the articles that you've written about it recently. And then a little bit after that, talk about the Four Loves, since it's related to Till We Have Faces. And then end a little bit with a book I know you've written about also, The Screwtape Letters.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, sure. That's a big fan favorite, right? Screwtape Letters, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Season 4 is going to be something else.
Yeah, that should be fun.
So let's talk about the book, which you yourself have described as among the 20th century's most important novels. And the one thing I've loved about Till We Have Faces is the number of people who have come out and say, I think this might be one of the most important books ever written.
Yeah. Well, and I use novel here in that kind of more strict non-fantasy, realistic psychological development kind of sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, I read this last year with Doris Lessing, The Golden Notebook, which is also epistolary, also kind of psychological development, but postmodern, and one of the most important 20th century books. And to me, it just fits in that category. I would put it with, some of those leading books. And important means a lot of funny things, though, doesn't it?
Indeed. But more than important, it's also just great. What is it that you love about the book?
Yeah. So I come in pretty generously accepting of people that have ideas in their works, right? So when I read, cli-fi, which is a big part of science fiction now, climate science fiction, the good stuff, it's not terribly obvious, but there's usually a kind of moral lesson or something near the surface of what's happening now. In a decade, it won't feel that way anymore, but that's where it is right now. So, and even masters like Margaret Atwood, she still has that kind of near the surface, right? C.S. Lewis's the big ideas in the text are pretty near the surface of the text, right? And that's true of this book, but really it's true only once you've gotten through the whole experience of having watched the world through a highly effective and highly self-deceived individual, right? So you're always bent the whole way through, never sure exactly what to trust about what you read, and then seeing this profound moment that comes out of these encounters with self and self-truth. To me, it has the sophistication that a lot of moral books don't have, and yet it's lacking. It's not preachy in any kind of way.
Absolutely.
But if we were just to read the second half, like, it would sound preachy. It's because we're drawn in by the unreliable narrator all the way through. It hits so hard in the second half. So that's for me as the surprise, And I mean, just before he wrote this, he was finishing up, The Last Battle and Magician's Nephew. So just from a literary history perspective, that's super weird. Like that's so amazingly different, right?
Different, and yet you can still very clearly see some similar themes running through both of them.
Yeah.
Particularly that of, I'd say, transformation.
Yeah. Well, I think there was actually there's a woman named Sister Gallagher who wrote a PhD thesis back in the early 80s. And she was nice enough to mail it to me because no library has it. So she physically mailed me the copy that was like sun bleached, sitting on a shelf for 35 years. And she does a really great job at showing that conversion and transformation are really at the center of what Lewis writes about. And I think she's largely right about that. And my PhD was in some ways a kind of conversation with that, kind of pushing that further and recentering things a little, but without losing that everyday conversion she was talking about, which I think was I can't remember which of the popes had brought that out in a encyclical talking about everyday conversion. It might have been John Paul II.
Sounds like him.
Yeah, and it does sound like him. And so she was really applying that to Lewis's works. That Lewis is in a sense intimating what John Paul II was trying to show as part of everyday life, part of reality anyway. So yeah, I think a transformation is a great way of capturing that. But you guys actually had. It's been a while since I listened to it, but you guys have actually had a whole conversation, I think, about like self-death.
Mm-hmm. Die before you die. There's no time after.
Yeah. And so that was my first, I think, published article on C.S. Lewis was back in 2013 or 2014, Die Before You Die, where I went through that idea in his fiction. And my thesis is largely that on a grand scale. And I think I think when we talk about transformation, well, falling into villainy is transformation, right?
Yeah. Not all transformations are good.
That's right. Accidentally doing the right thing and then being surprised by it is transformation. Moral, like what does Orual try to do? I will try my hardest to be a good person. Right.
And fails immediately.
It fails. But if she was a younger person and a bit more pliable in spirit, she wouldn't have been as successful, but she probably could have at least tidied up the moral house a bit, right?
Mm.
And so there are lots of transformations. So what do we mean by transformation? And I think it really comes down to that, to the what you guys were talking about, the die before you die, this loss of self, the giving up of the self. You know, sure, there's a hope of new life. There's the hope of resurrection on the other side of that. That's the pattern and the promise and the principle. But we can't just expect that, right?
Mm.
You think of Eustace in the Voyage of Don Treader, when he's been dragoned because he was thinking dragonish thoughts, and he was acting like a dragon acts, and then in a magical synchronicity, he becomes a dragon. To become undragoned requires the loss of self without absolute assurance that there will be something on the other side of that loss. And I think that pattern is there, and that's ultimately what Orual has to do, is to lose herself.
Matt and I were reading through The Voyage of the Dawn Treader for an episode that'll drop in a few weeks. And one thing, I've read The Dawn Treader, I have no idea how many times, but one thing I noticed this time was how Eustace, as the dragon, effectively rolls over. He presents his belly. He is in the most vulnerable position possible for Aslan to begin taking his skin off. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think part of what I do in my work, I don't know that I haven't blogged a lot about it because it's hard. It takes a lot of detail to get to it, is to look very carefully at movement and shape in texts. And I think you guys brought this out in the conversation with Andrew Ladso a few weeks ago, which is, as Orual's kneeling by the water, she then sees differently. She actually is able to see to the kind of the spiritual layer that exists with the physical, natural layer of reality. But I think it was you, I can't remember, but also added that she was unveiled at that moment too. Yeah.
And it makes sense. She was drinking water. She would physically have to be. Something I hadn't thought of, but the movement in the text is not unimportant. It's really important in Lewis. And I think, that kind of like total giving up is exactly the kind of hint that Lewis leaves in his books about what's most important in life, I think.
Now, in one of your recent articles, that you said that while you love Till We Have Faces, you hadn't written much about it, possibly because you don't fully understand it.
Yeah.
And you list a whole load of a series of questions of things that you keep asking yourself as you're reading it. Can you just talk a little bit about what some of those questions are?
Well, yeah, like that. I mean, that's a good point. Like when I'm in some of it is maybe my own growth. I mean, this is the problem. Like you had Andrew Ladso on a few weeks ago, and he's been reading this for decades and has been working on a text for a long time. His thinking is much more mature than I am, and unfortunately, he's also really very good looking and has a great voice. So there are other deficits there too, but like. I've only been reading this text really for a decade, and I still discover new things each time. Like, what does it mean that Orual is Ungit and Orual is Psyche, right? How do all those things link? Even the die before you die isn't explained fully in the text. You almost have to make some guesses. Okay, so it's not a Socratic death. It's not the full rule of the will, right? So it's not that kind of death. And there's, of course, a joke in there, too, right? Because, Socrates died of suicide, right? Well, I don't know if you call it suicide, but took his life in submission to the court, to the people, or to his class of people. And so, it's not those kinds of deaths. So what do we mean, right? So we have to kind of work on that. And so there's a lot that's unanswered in this text. It's really much more like a text of the 1960s than it is certainly of any of Lewis's writing. What does it mean to get a face? right? It's in the title. It's until
Yeah.
we have faces, right? Okay, so did she die with a face? Like, was when she faced herself, was that her face? Is she then like the new statue of Ungut in the temple? Like, this is like there's a lot of questions that I have.
Yeah, and I think this is why I now understand why people love this book. Aside from the fact that I think it's well written, that there's sort of a big kind of twisty kind of thing at the end, but Lewis doesn't lay things out on a platter for you. I think in most of his other books, with the possible exception of The Pilgrim's Regress, where you need a key to work out who everybody is, in this book, he doesn't lay things out on a platter for you just to simply consume. And the feeling that I've been getting as I've been going through this very, very slowly is he wants that wrestling. He wants you to wrestle with the text and wrestle with the ideas. And a lot of the things that he wants you to find are just a little bit beyond the text. It was like one of the things I always said that was wonderful about Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, if one had really had to compare it to The Lord of the Rings, is that Lewis draws a sketch and then lets you run with it. Whereas Tolkien will give you every little detail for every little piece of tobacco that is in Bilbo's pipe. Whereas Lewis gives you a sketch and then sends you on your way. And in this book, I feel like he does that with the ideas. Because in all of those questions, I'm sure you're not completely, I have no idea what this is. You have some intuitions, you have some ideas that you've drawn from the text, but you don't quite have your hands all the way around them.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of this book, I think, illustrates. Sorry, I'm going to say French, and I understand that this is a terribly academic thing to do, but this is what Lewis would do. The difference between savoir and connaître, or there's different, like Hebrew and Greek also have different kinds of knowledges, and I can never remember because in my French isn't good enough. I'm bilingual, but I never really exactly understood the difference in French. But in older French, there's the connected, integrated ways of knowing, and then there are the more intellectual or structured ways of knowing. And I think this book is really a much more intimate and connected kind of knowing book. And I think it's better read, in ways that make people anxious today, which is bringing your own story to the text and throwing yourself into it and allowing those things to mix together. And that makes people anxious, I think, because it means you're going to be offended at various parts, right? Or you're gonna see Lewis where he probably could have been a bit bigger in his thinking in a particular part or something, right? Well, I think that's actually fine. I think this works. I can break down the Great Divorce in all kinds of ways. I've got charts. I made charts. I love charts. But I think this is better, with a pencil in your ear, sitting, in a comfortable chair, coffee or tea or something else, and just really kind of enjoying it and talking about it and troubling over it and sitting with it and maybe reading it with other books. I did read the Golden Ass this week as well, with this book, as you guys did, and the Four Loves. Voyage of the Dawn Treader is a good companion. The Great Divorce, but even like other loves, right, or other books that are about love, right? I read Anna Karenina once with this. Although it took me way longer to read Anna Karenina than this book, right? And so a book that's about devouring love. A book where the reconciliation doesn't happen for everyone as it does for Orual. The principle's not introduced for most of the characters. So I don't know. That's the kind of, I'm pretty comfortable with not all the answers being there, but I'm also comfortable with spending part of my life exploring what it might mean.
Well, speaking of exploration, you have an article where you explore the similarities and differences between Orual and her father.
Oh.
Can you outline some of those for us? Because I thought this one came out actually at just the right time when Matt and I were recording, when Orual has the vision where she digs down through the pillar room.
Yeah.
So I had this in my head as we were talking about that.
Yeah, no, it was amazing, and I forget exactly what triggered it. I was just doing just doing reading, I guess, and I was actually thinking about something different. I was thinking about this is weird, but this is what I've said. Coming at this book in different ways, I was thinking, what would how would an anthropologist read this? And I saw within the text like 100 little details. So, for example, like, do you eat with your right hand or your left hand? What is the cycle of the moon with regard to superstitions? What kind of offerings work? What's the physical structures of the temples and the city and the economics and all kinds of stuff? So that's what I was thinking about as reading as an anthropologist, saying that this is like a culture that has been buried in the ground that has now been unearthed, and sits in crystalline form before us. So how do we understand it? So that's how I was reading it. And I haven't gotten to the point of writing that all up but I did get excited and thinking like, how Orual there's a bunch of ways that Orual is both the opposite of her father and the exact image of her father, right? So she's the opposite of the father in that she's actually a competent and beloved ruler, right? Like there's lots of incompetence in any kind of dictatorship, I think, but because you narrow your possibilities to the mind of one, and press the brutality and the lack of freedom and all those other things. And but she's a good economist. She actually uses economics to help the community recover from years of plague and famine and war and the threat of war. And she develops a pretty strong sense of what is possible. She uses her slaves differently. She treats people differently. She draws advisors in, and she does all these really smart things. But she also, in her heart, keeps going back to her father's reality, particularly thinking about rage and anger. And she talks a number of times about, I found myself in my father's own rage, right? And her father was abusive. Like he would beat her. He killed a slave boy for no reason in particular. He was a tyrant, and she has this tyranny in her heart all of the time. Do you expect to slug a bed your whole life, I think is the line, right? And that's at the beginning with her father and her. And then she does it with Bardia, the person she loves most in the world at that time. And then her father does it to her in a dream vision at the end as well, right? And you see that book ending. There's a certain sense that, I am Ungit, she cries. I am Psyche, she experiences. But I am, actually, I forget his name already. I am my
King
father.
Trom.
King Trom, that's right. There's actually one of those. I have it in my blog post somewhere, but I had to look it up. Where I am Trom, I am father, is also a truth, right? And so when we come to the second paragraph of the text at the very beginning of the book, we actually have this powerful word. Maybe actually it's the third paragraph. I was Orual, right? Written while she's still alive, and yet she has all these kinds of ways that she loses herself in this text, and one of them is as her father, in the negative side.
Yeah, and you in that article you had a really interesting link between Orual and Jadis from The Magician's Nephew.
Yeah, well, feminist scholars have done a lot of interesting and positive and a lot of weird and things in reading Lewis, and I don't know that any just popular writer has been held up with as much scrutiny in the 20th century as Lewis. And part of it is, it's Hemingway. They just kind of say, well, we don't. There's nothing there for me to kind of critique because it's just one kind of masculinity or is one kind of machoism. But with Lewis, there's all these kind of subtleties and possibilities that are mixed with all these kind of negativities and stereotypes. And so there's a lot of that. But you have here, Jadis as a tyrant versus Orual as a tyrant are really quite different things. And yet that one of the temptations is ownership in both. Right, Jadis, when she's Queen of Charn, and then when she is the false emperor of Narnia, she sets herself up and in a position where everyone is not just her servant, but actually her property in a certain kind of a way, and is there for her to utilize in whatever way she sees fit, which is often deadly. She's willing to wipe out an entire world for her own sake. Well, the temptation is much more intimate, I think, for Orual, but the same, which is the ownership of others, right? Slaves and things like that. That's the temptation her father had. For her, it's Psyche. Psyche is mine, is the phrase. And when you look at mine all the way through the text, you really see this kind of the tendrils of love have worked until it's a kind of a trap, until it's a kind of a hatred, and everything gets twisted around, right? And you see this, actually, I was listening to your podcast when Orual encounters Bardia's wife after Bardia has passed away, and the Bardia's wife, says, you've taken my husband, now you've taken my son, and Orual's like, well, why do you allow that? One word from you would have stopped all this. And she's like, well, do you think I would do that? Not in a million years, because, I want him to be a man, to be free, to be a person, to be his own, and to do great things that he is meant to be. If I keep him, then he's just a dog or something to own. And Orwell's like, how do you stand that? And it's kind of one of her most honest moments in the whole book, isn't it? Right? How do you stand that?
It does seem to really confuse her that somebody would treat somebody else that way, but it's making you unhappy. Why do you stand for it?
Yeah. I mean, and so this idea of self-sacrificial love is so parodied in Orual. It's a visual parody. I mean, when she uses a suicide, homicide to try and manipulate Psyche, but all that is needed is suicide. Mm-hmm. And she demonstrates it by driving a dagger through where? Her wrist, right? And so we have this parody of the cross, which is the ultimate image of self-sacrificial love. Right?
I hadn't noticed that.
And it's for Psyche, who is, of course, a Christ figure, right? She's dying for the sake of the people on something very much like a tree, right? A stake at the top of, I guess it was a tree, at the top of a hill, right? This is like, and so you have, Psyche and anti-Psyche, Christ and Antichrist, sitting there in that moment of manipulated love. And the opposition isn't just visual, it's also, you have Psyche, who is really, even though she's compelled, there's a kind of consent that she's giving to the sacrifice. Mm-hmm. She probably could have found a way to commit suicide before it happened or something. But she goes to the sacrifice in a kind of love, sacrificial love, whereas Orual tries to keep her from the sacrifice, but not out of sacrificial love, but for herself. Mm. And that's where I think you and Andrew Ladzo talked about the way that Four Loves links in, this possessive love versus a true love. I think that's one of the most powerful links with the Four Loves, is that idea.
Now, at the end of February, you posted another article. Earlier, you spoke about the anthropology of gloam.
Yeah.
I really liked this article because it was the Peasant Pagan Prayer. Try and say that quickly.
Yeah.
Where you spoke about the empathy that Lewis seems to have for the followers of Ungit, for this pre-Christian society. And the scene in the temple where this old woman comes in and is praying to the stone of Ungit, that broke my brain in the second part. It's like, what is Lewis trying to say here?
Yeah. And he may just be being authentic to the world building moment, right? So, or he is, that's at least part of it, right? Is how do I create an authentic world? And you're right, Narnia is far thinner than Lord of the Rings or Patrick Rothfuss's Name of the Wind world, or a lot of, Dune, there's a lot that's given in details, Ring World, things like that. So these great worlds we have typically are far more detailed and tight than Lewis's world. The great example in Narnia is, so you've had 100 years of winter, 100 years that you're trapped from other societies, and yet, Mr. Beaver has, fresh potatoes, his hops for his beer and mead. And, it's, there's sewing machines. There's a market for sewing machines, I guess. And so, Lewis isn't terribly tight in those ways, but fidelity for his world building works in another kind of a way. And some of that is intertextual. So he brings other worlds into his text. And I have something to say about something you guys were talking about Cupid and Psyche in the original tale in Lucius and what's going on here. But so there is a kind of fidelity there with this peasant prayer. Did I do pagan prayer in the temple? But there's there's a picture somewhere on the internet of Lewis sitting on one of the Stonehenge stones smoking a cigarette. Now, it was kind of, on a hike. He hiked down to Salisbury and up into the hills. And now you can't have access to it. You can't touch those stones.
No, those were the days when you could sit on the stones and have a cigarette.
Yeah, that's right. And so he's sitting there on this, and the stone's still laying. It's just he didn't push the stone down. But that's actually the context of this temple, right? Are these old standing stones, prehistoric, pre her world, that have been adapted into an active temple, unlike ours in England. It's not ours, the ones in England. Maybe more yours than mine. And
you're Canadian. They're yours too. It's part of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, they're yours too. And we now know more about why they were there. But Lewis reimagines it into a temple, and then fills that out into this whole sacrificial stuff. So there's lots of fidelity there. But Lewis also had this great kind of love for the pagan world. When he and his wife Joy, just a couple of years after this, 5 years after this, I guess, they went to Greece when she was dying. And they were at the temple. I guess it was the temple of Apollo. And Lewis wrote to somebody, well, I was tempted to pray to Apollo for healing. He said, but, I think even in this place, that could be taken up as a prayer to Christ, that he really felt like the pagan world was a sort of capital P for him that prepared people, for something that moved their religion just one step forward, their faith and ethics one step forward. And there's recently been a piece that Lewis wrote called a pagan, a Christmas for Pagans or something that was lost in history has been recovered. And he's like, I've been asked to write this, but England isn't pagan, it's heathen. If it was pagan, I would have all kinds of hope for it. But because it's heathen, I don't know what to say, but don't give in to Christmas too much, I think is basically his message. But, with paganism, you have, at the end of the Four Loves, he says, somebody else says, when the half gods are gone, then the true God arrives, and he says, no, I think that's upside down. He says, when you finally have the true God, then you can appreciate the half gods for what they are. And so he thought that mature Christians with a great imagination can live through and with the pagan world in all its literature and myth, and maybe even its neighborliness today, in a way that gives it kind of a full sense of what it is, without losing itself. It can then enhance our imagination. So that's why he's able to use magic, mythology, classical world stuff in a way that like in the American context, a lot of people are challenged, by Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Narnia. Some conservative Christians resist that because of all the pagan and magical realities in it. For Lewis is like, no, because we have the true God, we are able then to appreciate all those other things for all their richness. So I think that might be happening too. But in the text, of course, it's just to show the contrast between her and her own understanding of Ungit and what's possible in the hearts of others. So
I've often thought, as I was reading this particular book, how I would have loved to have seen a conversation between St. Jerome and C.S. Lewis. Because Jerome loved his pagan literature. He hated that he did, but he really loved it. And I think Jack could have sat down with him, and I think he could have been a little bit more at peace with it.
Yeah. Well, you wonder too, that's funny. I never thought of that kind of pairing. like I've thought of like pairing Tertullian with people but to watch the madness of it, I think more than anything. But like Jerome, I don't know. I don't know Jerome enough. Like he remains sort of fuzzy for me in the background. Like I wish he knew a bit more about the Jewish world. That I think if he had been a bit more invested in the Jewish context of early Christianity, that I think the Western world would have been, I think he was more important to that part than Augustine when it came to the treatment of Jewish people and the Hebrew context later. Not that we didn't benefit from having the translations and all, like he did huge stuff. I don't know. That's a funny conversation. I guess I've thought of more friendly conversations, like what if like Lewis and Bonhoeffer, or if, or Tolkien and, Paul the 23rd. That's maybe a little less friendly probably, but like, I've thought of other pairings, but I hadn't thought of that one. That's intriguing.
Yeah, whenever people talk about if you can have dinner with three people living or dead, I'm thinking about the pairing of the other people. It's that conversation that I want to see.
Well, and of course Lewis is very Augustinian, but he rejects Augustine in kind of two really big points. Is Augustine was just far too dismissive of the value of myth, right? And that was, I think, brought up in his whole world for him being like a loose heathen was bound up with this public life that included theater and the arts and all that kind of stuff. And so he just way too quickly moved past that. And there are many artists and critics today that are rereading Augustine, fixing Augustine, but using Augustinian structures for their work, but saying he was wrong on this point. And the second thing was the way that Augustine had this sense of, you can only love God truly. All other loves will always let you down. And Lewis's basic argument is, yeah, but like that's the risk. That's what we're here for. We throw ourselves in on that point. Now, of course, he may have read Augustinian wrong on that point, but Augustine wrong. But
and we've actually got an episode coming up with Dr. Lepoavi.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah, on his love work. Yeah, we've sucked him into Canada. He's actually been converted to Canadianism. So yeah.
Yes, I heard.
yeah, it happens, sometimes. So yeah.
Now, there was one other article I wanted to talk to you about that you wrote about. In April, you posted an article which was prompted by a digital liturgy, which a friend had made for that church's Zoom Vespers. What was it about that liturgy that really struck you?
So this is so she, like, actually kind of one of the moments that are happening right now. And so we're recording this at the beginning of May, of 2020, but this will come out later, is we are mostly all in the midst in the Western world of various kinds of lockdowns or isolation points. And so the way churches are dealing with it is really kind of interesting and creative. My own is a basic kind of, pop music on acoustic and then live stream preaching. And I had the misfortune of being in the middle of a series when the end of the world happened. It's really inconvenient. And the series was on heaven. I mean, how inconvenient, for the end of the world to come when you're talking about heaven. And so it was, but in this woman is a minister at kind of a mainstream, like a large urban Baptist church, and she's writing liturgy that can be done in Vespers services and evening services, and they've adapted, I think, a New Zealand Episcopalian service for this, and for their own context. And she had this beautiful line in it. In the midst of this, she had taken all her own nature photography and added some classical music and then this liturgy a part of it. And one of the sentences was, well, why should my heart be sad? And it was, the way she said it was so nice. She's a nice voice and it fit in really well. It fits with the song. But the first thing that I thought of when she wrote that was, well, why should my heart not dance? I think that's the line, right? And that line comes in Till We Have Faces. And it's a funny moment. It comes twice in Till We Have Faces. And it's one of these opportunities that Orual had to face truth and a bigger, more expansive and generous possibility than she could have imagined. But she resists it. She rules herself in resistance. And it occurs the first time when she is going up the mountain with Bardia to bury the bones of Psyche. I don't know how long, maybe 3 weeks or something after. And the winter's coming, and she decides to go and at least to give a queenly, princely burial for this royal sister of hers. And as she goes, like, they come out of the town where all these dreadful things had happened, out of her house where she's under the rule of her father, who's a tyrant. There's the death and the mourning, and she comes up into this gorgeous countryside. And we're really to think of the mountain as a natural temple in this book. And they come basically to the pavement in front of the temple, which is this beautiful natural environment. And Lewis loved nature; he loved walking and natural things. Narnia, of course, is so expansive in nature. And there, her heart begins to lighten, and her grief is set aside for a moment, and it's almost like a voice in her heart says, "Why should you not dance? Why should your heart not dance?" But then she rules herself. She conquers it. She's able to keep that joy from invading the grief that has come in her heart. And I've felt like this. My mother died recently. My father died. I had a brother die, a sister-in-law, a cousin. Some of my best friends now are struggling with cancer. And so I understand there's a kind of guilt when you laugh at a joke, or you take joy in a pastry or in a drink, or in the hug of a friend, or you actually have interests. Books actually satisfy. You feel a little guilty in the midst of grief in those moments. But we don't give in to those. Like, that's part of the healing. And eventually, if our grief is healthy, we will take up the memory of the one we've lost into the joy of future moments. But Orual can't do this. She has to keep Psyche. She mummifies Psyche in her mind before she gets to the point of burying the bones. Now, this is an important point, right? This mummification, this book, and I have an article I haven't finished on this, but this book is written just after Lewis had a powerful experience with one of his past, I guess, kind of like a student. Sheldon Van Auken has written about it in a book called A Severe Mercy, which is also a good pairing with this book, because Sheldon Van Auken's partner, Davy, has died. Lewis had been mentored to them both, helped them both find faith. Davy passes away, and Van Auken begins to kind of turn his heart towards suicide, basically, to be together. And Lewis senses this in the midst of the conversation by letters, which is hard to do, senses the danger, warns him of the danger that you taking your own life may not lead you to Davy, but actually might divide you from Davy. He says it very sensitively, so not a complete guilt or problem thing, but just very subtle. And then says, basically, you are in danger of mummifying her. And at that point, Van Auken had been going through their life, listening to every record that she ever listened to when they bought it, going day by day through the years of their life. Like in The Great Divorce, the woman that kept the boy's room that died, the exact same for a decade. And mummified the room, mummified the memories. And he actually uses that word mummification. And this is what Orual is doing. It's precisely that danger. And Lewis says in those letters to Van Auken that love has to die. Marriages have to die in order to, erotic love has to die in order to become a true marriage. In your case, it died before that transformation takes place. In a way, that's the easier transformation, because marriage, after years of decay instead of actual death of one thing and then living into another, is a terrible experience. Erotic love, in a sense, gives itself over to that more affection and friendship, and ultimately gets taken up into godly love. And that's how a marriage works. Not that the erotic goes away, it just gets transformed into the new godly love. And that's the thing that Orual needed to have happen with Psyche, is for her to allow a certain kind of, allow her to die and then to let her live in new ways. And she can't do that. She won't let her heart dance. She won't let joy in. She won't let light in. But she has a second chance, to do this. She meets Psyche on the mountain, alive and well, if she can only have eyes to see it. And Psyche says the same thing. What do you mean make plans? Why do we have to make plans? I'm here in my house. I'm with my husband, my lover. Why should we make plans? What is there to do? Why should your heart not dance? She says, and I'm just like, oh, wow. Anyway, it's a gorgeous line, but it's a powerful moment in the text that shows, and then I think connects to really everything that Lewis was working on through the 1950s at that moment. Yeah.
Well, I actually think that's a fantastic point to stop. I had wanted to talk about the Four Loves and the Screwtape Letters, but we were going great guns, so I thought, no, we're going to carry on talking about Till We Have Faces. But I would love to have you back on to talk about those books.
Yeah. Well, when you do your Screwtape Letters, I've done some research into the way that they fit in Lewis's World War II era writing. And so I'd love to come on and kind of talk about that. Because it's kind of fun. This is where you get into like book nerdness. Not that Screwtape Letters is thin, but just it doesn't have the complexity and expansiveness that Till We Have Faces does, and is much more experimental. This is Lewis writing kind of a letter a week for a few weeks, and so I'd love to kind of chat about that book.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking with me today. Where can people find out more about your work?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, you can always find me at www.pilgriminnarnia.com. And you can find me on Instagram and Twitter and things like that by just searching my name, Brenton Dickieson. And in my blog, we'll generally kind of talk about what's happening in my scholarship and things, and ways that you can take classes. We have an excellent master's degree program, and I'm part of also bachelor degree classes that have Lewis or literature and theology that are connected. So I'd encourage you to kind of reach out and let me know. And as I think you say with Pints with Jack, make sure you share this if you like it, and that other people have a chance to see. And really, I think what we want with your podcast and my blog and our work as readers is to invite people into a bigger space of experiencing these texts, right? And so share it if it works for you.
Wonderful. And listeners, please join us next time when Matt and I are going to be doing our Till We Have Faces retrospective, when we'll be going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.